answer that question directly.
Thank you, Governor.
We're giving away free Donald Trump gold.
Oh, this will be cut out.
Don't cut that out.
I don't know if
that
we
was
should
the best
cut it
part
out.
of the podcast so far.
We did not disclose that as an advertisement, Paul.
Donald Trump got to advertise on my show. I'll send him a bill, see if he pays it.
Though, Paul, because those ads are customized for your previous viewing. I'm sorry to inform you.
This is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. We're happy to have you back here today with our other host, Governor Doug Ducey, as well as Professor Henry Thompson. Now, today we're going to do an in-depth review of the debates that took place this week, both the Republican debate as well as the Galvin Newsom, Rick DeSantis debate. It's a fun discussion. I think you're going to enjoy it. We also, at the end of that, have a talk about income inequality. Hope you'll watch the whole thing. If you like what we're doing, push that subscribe button. Or if you decide that you'd like to, become one of our premium members at www.optamerican.com/premium. Thanks for being here. On to the show. Well, I'd like to welcome both of my co-hosts onto the show today. First, Professor Thompson, thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you, Paul. Good to see you. And Governor Ducey.
Governor Ducey, excited to see you here as well.
Great to see you, Paul, and you, Henry, as well. Looking forward to it.
All right, so we're right before the holidays, and this week there was a great debate that came on. It was the Republican Party debate. Only 4 candidates were left in it. And we're going to spend a little bit of time trying to analyze that today. And then we have some other current topics that we'll talk about afterwards. But what I want to start with is the Galvin Newsom debate, where he debated DeSantis. It was kind of a primer for what we were going to see 4 days later. There were parts of it that I thought where they were trying to speak over one another and insulting one another. But I actually thought that both of them did a pretty good job. I don't know if either one of you saw that debate or had any thoughts on it, but I'd love to know if you did, what your thoughts were.
I saw some clips of it, and I would say, to me, it's hard to really make the case for California in this current environment. The fact that there's actually an exodus from the Golden State. I think it was Reagan who said, had the Pilgrims landed on the West Coast, they wouldn't have bothered to discover the rest of the country. And that's been so true of California for decades. Yet today, we do see businesses and people fleeing. Of course, Ron DeSantis has an incredible record in Florida. I think he's able to brag on that rather proudly. I give Gavin credit for going into the lion's den of Fox News with Hannity as moderator. I think somebody asked, do you think you'll see Ron DeSantis on MSNBC with Rachel Maddow? I think that would be interesting to see that type of thing. I do think we need more of these types of debates and discussions. I think they can be built up a little bit too much as almost a cage match. But some discussions around policy at the state level, I think, is worthwhile. Americans vote with their feet. I'm proud of much of what happened in Arizona over the last 8 years, and I think Ron has that kind of record that he was able to beat a drum on.
Yeah, I thought they both did a great job. Again, I thought there was bickering that didn't need to happen, but gosh, I wish that both of them were the nominees of their parties this year. I think it would be a much better presidential race if they were. One of the things that that I found to be interesting also, you're right, there's an exodus from California, and it's not completely new. I don't know that Galvin's responsible for all of it. I know when I was mayor, I remember one time I went over to campaign in San Francisco. We were trying to draw some of their businesses into Arizona. And just by chance, the earthquake had happened like a week before. So we ended up having a massive turnout because of the problems. And Willie Brown showed up. Now, if you don't know Willie Brown, he was a powerhouse. Yes. There's just no other way to look at him. So I'm up there as this young mayor knowing that this powerhouse is in the back of the room, not very happy about the fact that I'm there to try to lure their businesses into Arizona. And so at the end of my speech, he said, well, Mary says, I have a question for you. I said, sure. He said, you know, what's it like on those 115-degree days? You talked about all the great things about Arizona, but why don't you tell them about some of the heat waves that you've had? And I said, oh, Mr. Brown, I said, yeah, they're a real problem. I says, in fact, that's the months that all of our homeless pack up and move to San Francisco.
How do you take that?
People, he said, I'll get you, which I always worried about.
Yes.
But Governor, I know you've done, you've seen a lot of growth coming from California into Arizona as well.
Well, we have such a value proposition in Arizona, not only in terms of quality of life, but lower taxes, lighter regulation, reliable energy, ample water, educational choice. And I do think there was probably a time, and God bless mayors like you, Paul, that were out there pitching at a time when California was at its peak. I've always thought we have a great place to live here, but for many years, Californians kind of looked down their nose at the rest of the country because things did seem so good on the coast. Now I think we have a great case to make. And I also think that because of the difficult environment on a number of fronts, you get a look. And governors compete with each other. States compete with each other. And if you look at places like Arizona, Texas, Florida, Tennessee, these are really different and diverse places, but you see these policies going into place in contrast with places like California, Illinois, New York State. And like I said, I think people and businesses have responded with voting with their feet.
Obviously, American politics is the area where I have the least expertise here, but I would say one of the greatest strengths of this country is having this competition among states, right? It's relatively unique in the developed world that you can have people choosing between a California or an Arizona or a Texas and being able to vote with their feet and go where they think that the economy is the strongest, where they have the best job prospects, etc. And what I thought was really great was to see these two really prominent exponents of each model, right? The Florida model versus the California model, being game, as Governor Ducey said, being game to get up there on Fox News and kind of have the debate. But in the back of my mind, and I didn't watch the whole thing, I have to admit I only watched the highlights. In the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, why are these two doing this at this time when one of them claims he's not running for president at all and the other is really lagging in the presidential primary? And I couldn't help but wonder whether maybe this is not about this year or about next year, but maybe about the next presidential cycle. And these two individuals trying to position themselves as the sort of candidates apparent for the next presidential cycle. And I'd be interested in both of your thoughts about that, actually, because as you said, Paul, why would Newsom subject himself to this on Fox News? Well, I think he did a decent job. There were no sort of real howlers, as we would say, the humiliating moments to go on YouTube or whatever, and maybe just positioning himself as the major competitor to DeSantis is all he wanted to do for the next presidential cycle.
I think that's absolute. First, I love the point that you just made about states competing with one another. I agree with you. That's a really positive thing that happens in the United States. And it does force a higher level of accountability on things like taxes and regulations. Governor Ducey actually had me work on one group where his staff asked me to work on a group they were trying to attract into Arizona. I remember this group talking about literally them taking 7 years to get the zoning in on a site that they owned in California. And in 9 months, we could build from scratch the same project for them and move those bodies into Arizona. It's funny, Doug, some people made fun of you for being an ice cream salesman when you started running. But the one thing I knew about you is the Entrepreneurs Organization loved you because they knew that it wasn't just about ice cream. It was your love of business. It was your love of franchising. It was your love of entrepreneurs. And one thing you did as governor, you worked really hard engaging a whole lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds to make certain that economic development was one of our prime issues.
Well, thank you, Paul. And, when you're opening up small retail stores, I mean, that's the definition of small business. That's also the definition of really powerlessness as you're going into different states. It's really only the the product or attractiveness of what you're selling, and then the policies that they have that allow you to open. And I really wondered, as we opened Cold Stone Creameries over all 50 states, I thought that was the best primer possible to run for governor, because I was able to see these policies at work and how it put the small business person, the franchisee, in a position to be successful, or was an obstacle to them. And I think it was also helpful when we have these economic development discussions. So all governors get that opportunity. I do think it's a real advantage to have spent time in the private sector before entering public life, because I at least had some experience and subject matter expertise in something other than politics.
I agree. And Henry, to answer your question directly, both of those two people, look, I know that there are Republicans that hate Galvin Newsom and Democrats who hate DeSantis, but those are two talented individuals. You just can't take that away from them. You look at DeSantis's education, his background, his career, his military service. You just can't argue. That's a top-flight, top-notch individual. We're lucky that people like him are still running, regardless of whether you like his policies or not. He's the type of person we should be trying to recruit into politics. And Galvin, I would say, is the same. I agree with Doug. I think he had a much tougher time of having to defend California, because California is going through some tougher times. And also, he was on Sean Hannity's show and Sean obviously wasn't completely being fair in his show, but nonetheless, they both got a chance to give their input. Now, that brings us to the Republican debate. And what I want to do on the Republican debate is I want to talk about at least kind of what I saw. I'm definitely interested in both of your thoughts, but I want to start with what I thought was maybe the most controversial comment that happened in the debate. And it was done by Chris Christie, and it really was about this concept of, should we commit troops to Israel? So if we can, I'll have Slater play that tape for us.
But would you send American troops?
Elizabeth, look, this is the problem with the first three debates. Ron gets asked a question, and he doesn't answer it. Your question was very specific. You said, would you send American troops as commander-in-chief? And he went on to this minute and 30-second hosanna about his knowledge of the military and what we need to do, and didn't answer your question. Look, when you're president of the United States, you're not going to have a choice whether to answer that question or not. Your generals, your Secretary of Defense, your Secretary of State, your National Security Advisor are going to present plans to you. They're going to look at you and say, do we go or don't we, Mr. President? And you can't give a 90-second speech about your military service, as laudable as it is.
Would you send American troops in to rescue those hostages?
Absolutely. If they had a plan which showed me that we could get them out safely, you're damn right I'd send the American Army in there to get our people home and get them home now. And I'll answer that question directly.
Thank you, Governor.
We're giving away free Donald Trump gold.
Oh, this will be cut out.
Don't cut that out.
I don't know
That
if we
was the
should cut
best
it
part
out.
of the podcast so far.
We did not disclose that as an advertisement,
Okay.
Paul.
Donald Trump got to advertise on my show. I'll send him a bill, see if he
Worse than you
pays
think, though,
it.
Cole, because those ads are customized for your previous viewing. I'm sorry to inform you.
The big tech has gotten control of us. All right, so here's what I liked about what Chris did. If you would have asked me that question up front, I would have said, hell no, I wouldn't send American troops into that. But he was very good at channeling that answer and bringing me down to something that I said, oh yeah, I would do that. The way that he's picked that out, you've identified a mission, you've identified and something that's important, an American strategic issue, which is the folks who've been captured from us, having a plan and then executing on that plan. Either way, I thought Chris did a really good job of answering what would normally be a very, very tough question for somebody running for president.
I think one part of his response is doing a lot of work there, which is the part where he qualifies his statement by saying if there was a plan, that it could be done safely. And I think that is an almost impossible proposition given the close combat, urban warfare situation there in Gaza. And so I think that there's kind of a huge escape hatch for him out of that statement from something that seems like a rock solid statement in support of getting those American hostages out. There's a huge escape hatch for him there. And when you actually think through the logistics and the realities of trying to get hostages out of some sort of a Hamas compound in the middle of Gaza. So I agree with you that it comes across as a forceful statement, and I totally think that there needs to be as much done as possible to get American hostages and other hostages out of Gaza, but I think that there's a little bit of a escape hatch in that statement.
I thought Chris appeared skillful and decisive, which is what he is. He did qualify it, that he'd want to see a plan, that it could be done safely. But I believe this is why special forces exist. And if it's the Navy SEALs or the Army Rangers or whoever we're going to put in there, they're going to get our hostages. I think you have to make it clear that we're not entering a new war overseas. We're going to rescue Americans.
Yep. All right. So the next comment that I want to take from the debate was Nikki Haley's. I think Nikki Haley has probably done the best job of providing a defense for our involvement of Ukraine, not just of the people who are in the debate, maybe of any American politician today, at least that I'm watching. If we can, let's roll that tape on Nikki Haley in Ukraine.
Were you saying that it's time to bomb Iran?
No, I was not saying it's time to bomb Iran, but I will tell you, I dealt with Iran every day when I was at the United Nations, and they only respond to strength. What they don't respond to is when you weaken the sanctions like they did on Iran that allowed China to send them billions to fill their proxies. What they don't respond to is when you give $6 billion for 5 hostages. That only makes them want more hostages. What they don't respond to is when they do 140 strikes on our men and women in Syria and Iraq, and we do nothing but just some small shots back. You've got to punch them, you've got to punch them hard, and let them know that. That's the only way they're going to respond. So the way you do that is you go after their infrastructure in Syria and Iraq where they're hitting our soldiers. That's what you do, and then that's when they'll back off. The problem is you have to see that all of these are related. If you look at the fact Russia was losing that war with Ukraine. Putin had hit rock bottom. They had raised the draft age to 65. He was getting drones and missiles, drones from Iran, missiles from North Korea. And so what happened? When he hit rock bottom, all of a sudden, his other friend, Iran, Hamas goes and invades Israel and butchers those people on Putin's birthday. There is no one happier right now than Putin because all of the attention America had on Ukraine suddenly went to Israel. And that's what they were hoping is going to happen. We need to make sure that we have full clarity that there is a reason, again, that Taiwanese want to help Ukrainians because they know if Ukraine wins, China won't invade Taiwan. There's a reason the Ukrainians want to help Israelis because they know that if Iran wins, Russia wins. These are all connected. But what wins all of that is a strong America, not a weak America. And that's what Joe Biden's given us.
So here's the thing that I thought about Nikki's comment. She's doing a good job of showing how these things are connected. A lot of folks are saying, the road to Taiwan for China goes through Ukraine. And I think that there's truth to that. But more importantly, the United States is facing 3 pretty serious fronts today, Ukraine, Taiwan, as well as what's going on in Israel. And she makes a connection for them. Thoughts, Governor?
Well, geopolitically, there are connections here. I think Nikki knows what she's talking about. I think that we need to project strength as a nation and then make decisions on where we want to engage. And of course, we want to be supporting our allies. I think we can also do a better job of telling the public what success looks like in these endeavors. And then, of course, whatever we're doing behind the scenes in terms of diplomacy. I think you want to have a large investment in what you're doing there because when the investment becomes the military investment, all the calculus changes. Nobody in this nation wants to be in another war, and whatever we can do to deter on that front or allow our allies to be successful is a win for America.
Yeah, it is interesting. In all 3 of those cases, it's them doing the fighting, us providing the provisioning. Now, Henry, Australia, we just did a big deal with them to give them nuclear submarines, somewhat to the chagrin of France, who was mad at us about it because they wanted to sell them diesel submarines. What's your view of all this? I know you are now an insider, at least inside the United States, but from the perspective that you brought with you, how would you see this whole thing?
So I am from the Asia Pacific region, right, which is very concerned with Chinese aggression against any neighboring countries, Australia more so than New Zealand, by the way, for various different reasons. So the Asia Pacific region has a large interest in the maintenance of American power, and that doesn't only extend to Australia and New Zealand, but also many countries in Southeast Asia as well, right? So places like Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia all have a huge interest. The Philippines in the maintenance of American power in the Western Pacific to keep those trading routes open, to keep their economies open, not just to China, but to the rest of the world. And so there's a certain sense of concern whenever American authority in the international system starts to waver. And so I think that Nikki Haley is absolutely correct in trying to emphasize what we might call the establishment of American deterrence. When she talked about pushing back against Iranian interests in Syria and Iraq, if those interests strike American troops, etc., that's about establishing some sort of pattern of punishment for defection or aggression by another state. And so I think that that's absolutely right, because it will lead to more peaceful relations in the future if countries are absolutely certain that the United States will strike back if its interests are affected, including with military force. The situation with Ukraine, I think, is complicated because deterrence failed in Ukraine. I think that we all have to remember that history didn't start only a few days after Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, but that American deterrence failed, thereby facilitating or allowing the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And reestablishing deterrence or in that situation is much more fraught because it involves some sort of a negotiation about where the status quo is going to be going forward. And that's what this whole debate is about. So I think that the situation in the Middle East vis-a-vis Iran is different to the situation vis-a-vis Russia in Ukraine for the simple fact that deterrence has already failed in Ukraine, and we need to establish some sort of a benchmark from which we will try and reestablish order in that part of the world. Whereas in the Middle East, there isn't open conflict between the United States and Iran yet. Iran hasn't invaded a neighboring country yet, and so deterrence is still possible. That's my take on the situation with those two different states.
Yeah, I think my take on Ukraine is, again, we keep looking at this war from a standpoint of it's now a stalemate, and that certainly doesn't feel well. It doesn't feel like it's what we would like it to be, and it can end up being a very long-standing war. But in terms of deterrence, I think that the war actually may have created a deterrence for the Soviet Union going forward. They expected NATO to fall apart. That's just what they expected. They did not expect that they would stand together. They did not expect that the United States would sacrifice over this. And candidly, it's because out of their experience in the past when they took over Crimea, we didn't stand up. We gave some strong words and some, a strongly worded letter telling them why we disapproved of what it was that they were doing. But their view was we were a paper tiger. I think the one thing that's happened in this war so far is they have recognized that NATO and the United States are not a paper tiger. And if they can unite and if they can hold together, Russia just simply cannot overcome them. And I think that's going to be helpful to us in stopping their longer-term aggressions.
Well, in terms of the deterrence, I guess we'll see. Of course, it's a hot conflict right now, but where this winds up, if there's a negotiated peace, if there's a retreat, which I wouldn't expect at this time, and how much longer it goes on, and it can't go on much longer without our active engagement. So I applaud Nikki for being vocal and decisive. I am someone who is more a fan of the Teddy Roosevelt model of speak softly and carry a big stick. That's very difficult when you're running for president and when we're negotiating these conflicts and potential wars during a campaign season. It's often said, as someone campaigns, is how they'll govern. And when you do present things on the campaign, it certainly gives you permission to do it in your administration once you're victorious. And I always think on the foreign policy discussion during campaign season, people can put themselves in an unenviable position should they be successful. So not only thinking through what you believe, what you think the right thing is for the nation to do, what you believe that primary electorate wants and needs to hear, but then what would happen upon completion once you take the oath of office.
James Carville said once to me a long time ago that the single greatest thing that we have to hope for is that politicians don't live up to the promises that they made in campaigns. All right. So let's go to what I think was the most, the standout portion of the debate. And it was interesting to watch. I'd love to get both of your guys' opinions, but these two next clips go together. So let's start with, roll the discussion that Ramaswamy had where he began taking on Nikki Haley.
After you left the UN, you became a military contractor. You actually started joining service on the board of Boeing, whose back you scratched for a very long time, and then gave foreign multinational speeches like Hillary Clinton is, and now you're a multimillionaire. That math does not add up. It adds up to the fact that you are corrupt. And when I said they were bought and paid for, I meant the Republican establishment, not the Democratic establishment. Now you have Reid Hoffman, the person who's effectively George Soros Jr., funding lawsuits across this country against Donald Trump to keep him off the ballot, funding left-wing causes. We discovered this week that he is one of Nikki Haley's largest supporters. Larry Fink, the king of the woke industrial complex, the ESG movement, the CEO of BlackRock, the most powerful company in the world, now supporting Nikki Haley. And to say that doesn't affect her is false, because it's after that meeting later that day that she says that every American needs to be doxxed by having their ID, their government-issued ID, tied to what they say on the internet. So I think that this is far more corrupt than I even imagined when I entered politics. But I will say this. It is going to take a leader from the outside, with fresh legs, from the next generation to unite this country. Not the broken politicians who are puppets of the puppet masters, but the actual people in this country. Thomas Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I think it's going to take somebody whose best days in life are still ahead to see a country whose best days are ahead of itself. And I think I can reach that next generation better than anybody else in this race.
Thank you.
Okay, first question. That was pretty much a direct hit, all talking about money. Of course, it's not lost on me that Nikki Haley is beginning to surge, so she's raising money from the same people that anyone else would have taken money from, truth be known. But is that an effective hit?
One, I don't think it's accurate. I don't think Nikki Haley is corrupt. I think all of these folks would have loved for the Koch network to be their supporter, and she is rising in the polls. So I thought she handled that pretty well when she said, "Thanks for all the attention, fellas." And that might work with a small subset of the primary electorate that want to buy into some of this shouting down and establishment talk. But Nikki was an effective governor of a southern state. She did an excellent job as ambassador to the UN. And Vivek, you said the most controversial comment was what Chris Christie said about raising troops. I think Vivek calling Nikki Haley corrupt, and I think he might have called her a fascist, is well what would be the points that I would say were the most controversial of the night.
Yeah, it's funny because I obviously was on the Democratic side during the time I was in politics, and there was a lot of negative comments about the Koch brothers. But if I were being honest, I think the thing that my friends hated the most about the Koch brothers, they didn't give any money to us. So it's how politics works, right? Everybody has to raise money to be able to make their campaigns work. And the question is, if you're the type of person who will sell out for the money, you'd sell out anyway. You'd sell out for a different reason. Usually, people give money to people that they support because they think ideologically they'd be the best candidates. There are a lot of Democrats today that think that Nikki Haley would be a great candidate. One, because they think that she could beat Donald Trump, and that's their bigger worry. That's their much bigger worry. But also because they think that having a woman in the White House would be something that would be attractive to them. Point I guess I'm getting to is I think that money oftentimes or usually is given to people who the financial giver supports as opposed to being done for corrupt reasons. But I know that's controversial. Henry, you're kind of on the outside of politics. What was your view of this hit?
I think that the unmistakable or unmissable reality is that the front runner wasn't on this debate stage. And it seems to me that voters are rational and they're waiting for potentially an opening for one of these people to become a viable challenger to Donald Trump. And I think that three of the people on the stage seem to be trying to become that viable challenger, whereas my suspicion is that Ramaswamy is actually trying to become Trump's vice presidential nominee or get a position in his cabinet, right? Because the others are trying to present themselves as something different to Trump, whereas he's very much going this populist sort of bring down the elites kind of path. And so I almost felt like they were talking past one another, coming from such different worlds, that when Nikki Haley, I think her response was, it's not worth my time to respond to that. I think that was absolutely accurate, and not just because it was rude, but because the people that were listening to Ramaswamy aren't going to listen to her anyway. He wasn't speaking to the people that she's trying to reach. He was speaking to the Trump campaign and to a small group of Trump supporters. That's my interpretation of what was going on there on the debate stage.
Yep. All right. So let's play this next comment. Let's roll this next tape. I thought this was maybe the best comment made during the debate, or the one that advanced the candidacy further than any of the others. This one's from Governor Chris Christie.
It takes an outsider to see this through. Look at the blank expression. She doesn't know the names of the provinces that she wants to actually fight for. And there's her puppet masters right there. The donors right there that are playing her like the puppet master.
Hold on.
Let me just say something here. His reasonable peace deal in Ukraine, he made it clear. Give them all the land they've already stolen. Promise Putin you'll never put Ukraine in Russia, and then trust Putin not to have a relationship with China. Let me tell you something. That's no reasonable.
That's not my deal. That's not my deal.
Yes, it's exactly what you said. You do this at every debate.
I'll tell you exactly what it is.
Don't interrupt me. I didn't interrupt you. Okay? You say this. You do this. You do this at every debate. You go out on the stump and you say something. All of us see it on video. We confront you out on the debate stage. You say you didn't say it, and then you back away. And I want to say
exactly what I said, Chris.
I'm not done yet.
Well, this
now look.
This is nonsense. This man is spewing. This man is spewing nonsense.
Let me tell you something. This is the fourth debate that you would be voted in the first 20 minutes as the most obnoxious blowhard in America. So shut up for a little while.
I'm going to respond to that.
Chris, your version of
We're going to let you respond to that. We're going to let you respond to that.
I'll take that.
Finish.
I want to say something else. We're now 25 minutes into this debate, and he has insulted Nikki Haley's basic intelligence, not her positions, her basic intelligence. She doesn't know regions. She wouldn't be able to find something on a map that his 3-year-old could find. Look, if you want to disagree on issues, that's fine. And Nikki and I disagree on some issues. But I'll tell you this, I've known her for 12 years, which is longer than he's even started to vote in the Republican primary. And while we disagree about some issues and we disagree about who should be president of the United States, what we don't disagree on is this is a smart, accomplished woman, and you should stop insulting her.
So I'm going to take this, several times over. So first of all, I think we just learned something from Chris Christie. We learned three things. We learned three things right there. First of all, Chris Christie also doesn't know what provinces in eastern Ukraine he actually wants us to fight for. Chris, your version of foreign policy experience was closing a bridge from New Jersey to New York. Yeah. So do everybody a favor, just walk yourself off that stage, enjoy a nice meal, and get the hell out of this race.
Let me tell you.
When it comes to Nikki, I think if you're going to actually send your sons and daughters to go die in somebody else's war, you better, excuse me, Chris, I'm speaking, and I'm not done yet.
I haven't heard a time when you aren't
and we're going to be
speaking.
done. So listen up to this, is if these people want to send your sons and daughters to go die in Ukraine, they've been arguing for it for a year. $200 billion of our taxpayer money sent over. Neither of them could even name for you the provinces that they actually want to protect. And this is the people who have been touting their so-called foreign policy experience. It is intellectual fraud. These people are lying to you, the same people who told you about weapons and mass destruction in Iraq. To justify that invasion, didn't know the first thing about it, yet they sent thousands of our sons and daughters to go die. The same people who told you the same in Afghanistan, where the Taliban is still in charge 20 years later. $7 trillion of our national debt due to these toxic neocons. You can put lipstick on a Dick Cheney, it is still a fascist neocon.
Thank
and
you,
you
Mr.
got to see that
Ramaswamy.
today.
Thank you, Mr.
It's Dick
Ramaswamy.
Cheney all over again in this party.
Thank you, Mr. Ramaswamy. 15 seconds.
Name the provinces. Neither of you could even name the first thing about Eastern countries.
I think we've had enough of this. And Crimea.
Think about that.
Let me just.
It's actually, Crimea is the wrong answer.
All right. The floor is Christie's.
All right. Let me just say this. You know, this is the kind of thing where he talks about experience. You know, I was the U.S. attorney in New Jersey when the terrorist attacks were launched against the United States in 2001. I brought the first two cases in this country against terrorists who tried to attack us again. And I know about the threat of terrorism and bullying in this country and around the world. And at that time, he was learning about the provinces in Ukraine, sitting with his smart-ass mouth at Harvard. That's what was going on. And so the fact of the matter is, and back then he was a Democrat. So you know the fact is that all he knows how to do.
Well, you were busy hugging Barack Obama getting him elected.
Thank you.
All he knows how to do is insult good people who have committed their lives to public service.
All right. So thoughts on that?
Well, I thought Chris Christie really shined in that moment. I think him pointing out that the insults and name calling were unnecessary. And I think, you can just see how comfortable he is on the stage, the command he has of the issues. And I think it also begs the question as to what his objective is. What he wants to do up there. He does switch his positions. He says things publicly and then comes on the stage and says that he didn't say them. I know there's value to being an outsider. I was an outsider at one point as well. But I think, some of the name calling, some of the claims of corruption with no evidence just aren't worthwhile, and they don't add much to this discussion or help people make a proper decision. The other thing, and maybe this will be ahead in the show, and if it is, I don't want to be a spoiler here, but I also think Chris did a service to the process when he pointed out that nobody's talking about Donald Trump except him. And I do think if you want to be the man, you have to beat the man. So it does make you wonder, are people playing for second place, or do they want to be president of the United States and the nominee of the Republican Party?
All right, so I'm going to play on that a little bit, and it kind of goes to Henry's point that he was talking about earlier also. We talk about how do you win this when Donald Trump is so far ahead, and I just want to give a little bit of my experience. My very first presidential campaign that I was involved with, I've been involved with 3 of them, but the first one, I was a very young guy. I'd just been elected to the city council. I think I was about 25 years old. And Gary Hart came to Arizona. It was his first campaign, not the second one with Donna Rice and all the other scandal that happened. This was when he was just a young senator. He had a little bit of notoriety because he had actually met face-to-face, I believe, with Gorbachev, and that gave him some exposure. But I decided to support him. I decided to get involved in his campaign. Now, in 1984, Walter Mondale was the guy. All right. He literally, the reason I ended up becoming the chairman for Gary Hart in Arizona is because there wasn't a single other Democrat that would do it. No one wanted to support him. Walter Mondale was going to be the guy. Everybody believed that. There was no way around it. A vice president has a tremendous amount of power when they run, because what they do for 4 years or 8 years when they're the vice president, they go around and shake hands and they meet people and they build friendships, and that gives them the ability to create an organization, both financially as well as the grassroots component that you need to make it work. So with Gary Hart, we went forward in the race. And again, I think there were 9 candidates. I can't remember who all 9 were, but what I do recall is that we go to Iowa. Our entire campaign was in New Hampshire. We were spending every minute of our day in New Hampshire trying to get New Hampshire to work for us. But in Iowa, we end up having a race that at the end, Gary Hart comes in second place. Now, the polls before the primary had Walter Mondale at about 48%. Walter Mondale got about 48% in Iowa. Gary Hart got 16%. But it was such a surprise. And because he was second, they put a tremendous amount of attention on him. And that began to create a shift. Then we won in New Hampshire. Now, we had no money in New Hampshire. But by the time we got done winning in New Hampshire, after coming in a distant second, which is the way it could have easily been framed, a distant second in Iowa, the race changed. And from that point on, we won 26 states. We won Arizona. That was the state that I was in charge of. We won 26 states with a much more moderate message, a much more positive, upbeat message than Mondale had. Mondale's message became, where's the beef, meaning what's the difference between the candidates. But the only reason Gary lost was because of the superdelegates. That was the very first time I was introduced to superdelegates, but there were authorized superdelegates and those who had the ability to change their mind. And the ones that could change their mind were party officials. And all the party officials in Arizona, even though Gary Hart had won here overwhelmingly, they voted for Walter Mondale. Right? And that was just the way the superdelegate process worked. I think we lost by 22 delegates. It was an incredibly tight race. But the point I'm giving is, do not count this race as over. It is not even close to being over. Iowa and New Hampshire are going to matter. Now, I would argue on the Democratic side, the same is true. I know that everybody's looking at this Democratic race and they're saying, oh, come on, Joe Biden has got this thing locked up. There's a young guy running against him. His name's Dean Phillips. Dean Phillips made a lot of money in businesses much like yours, Governor. He's out there running a campaign. He's going to do better than people think. And if he does better than people think, I would not be at all surprised to find Joe Biden doing a Lyndon Johnson move. The type of thing I won't seek, nor will I accept the nomination of my party. Well, why'd that happen? Because he began to figure out that he was going to have a problem. He had some opposition in the early primary, and then after that opposition, Robert Kennedy got into the race, and that began to change the race itself. Governor, you were going to say something.
Well, I want to push back on that. First, I agree with you that Iowa and New Hampshire can shock the world, and they've done it in the past. So not a vote has been cast yet. Let's wait and see. And they've got to prosecute their campaigns. I do think you have to talk about the issue that's not in the room, and that's the former president. So that's the challenge on the right. On the left with Joe Biden, the pushback I'd give you here, Paul, is the reason that happened to Lyndon Johnson was because the party was strong, and the party could actually tell the president of the United States to stand down, and he would listen. The parties are weak today. The party on the left, all Joe Biden has ever wanted to be his entire life as president of the United States. He's run 4 times. He finally has what he wants. So while I wish he would stand down and let a newcomer compete for it, I don't think he's going to do that. And I think Dean Phillips can cause him harm and cause him damage, but I don't think Dean Phillips is going to be the nominee. And part of the reason he's going to get so much attention is the press really does love Republican on a Republican violence, and they love the distraction of somebody challenging from inside his party the sitting president. I listened to a podcast where the congressman gave an interview. He came off as incredibly likable. I think many of his policy stands are much to the left of what he presented on that podcast, but I do think it will be a distraction for Joe Biden. I don't think it's going to keep him from the nomination if Joe Biden wants the nomination. I think the right thing for him to do, though, would be to let a fresh face. He said he was going to be a transition nominee and president, and he's shown no evidence of that. If anything, he's just desperately clinging to the office.
I think that I agree that there's a chance that things change quickly, right? Voters are rational. They can change their vote intentions very quickly, especially if a new focal point emerges, a candidate emerges as a sort of a person around whom opinion starts to coalesce. But I think on the Republican side, at least, for that to start to happen, there has to be some sort of a potential for that person to actually win, right? To beat Trump in this broader primary process. And on the one hand, Trump, his polling numbers remain ridiculously strong. Something like 2/3 or 55% or something of the Republican primary voters want to vote for him, depending on the state, is my understanding. And on the other hand, it doesn't seem to matter what sort of scandals where he becomes embroiled in legal troubles, etc. It doesn't seem to move that number very much. And I would say also what's really important in this debate at the moment is that Trump in his head-to-head against Biden is also strengthening. So this argument that you should defect from the Trump camp to join another candidate, perhaps as well coalesce around one alternative candidate, that's being weakened as Trump's strength against Biden becomes more concrete. So at least at the moment, to me, the trends are pointing very strongly towards a Trump winning the nomination for the Republican side again. And I agree with everything that Governor Ducey said on the Democratic side. It seems to me that that these challenges to Biden are relatively minor at this point. Although I agree with you, Paul, that things can change and they can change like a landslide, sometimes very fast. But there need to be certain conditions for that to happen, and I just can't see them at the moment.
So a couple of predictions I'll make, and it's always dangerous to make predictions, but I'm going to do it for fun. The first prediction I'm going to make is there are things that are going to come out of this race that nobody's expecting. I've just been through this so many times in terms of watching these primaries, and what you think is going to happen is not always what happens. I'm going to bet that in one of these two cases, either Biden or Trump ends up not being the nominee. And I believe the first party who ends up selecting a delegate that is not Trump or Biden is going to end up becoming the president of the United States. They're going to win that general election. That's a huge incentive for people to change. Now, I'm positive of this. On the Democratic side, there are a lot of Democrats that know that Biden is problematic. Even if he beats Trump, his age is still an issue, and there's a concern about that. I think you have a much higher odd than you think after New Hampshire of seeing other candidates that begin to get into that race. And if more candidates get in, Biden will have a bigger problem than you think. There are 3 candidates that have drawn down packages so that they can run their super PACs. One of them is Gavin Newsom. The other one certainly is the governor of Michigan. There are Democratic people who understand, or candidates and people in positions that know that he's weakened and something can happen there. On the other side, I really do think Nikki Haley has a strong chance of coming in second in Iowa, and I will bet you Chris Christie ends up winning New Hampshire. If those two things happen, that primary is going to be opened back up.
I want to ask you a question on this, Paul, because what you said on the Democrat side, I've heard from so many people, and I think there's even some crackpot ideas that I hear basically smart, credentialed people putting forward. So I always ask, give a historic example of when something like you're suggesting has happened in the past. Because when you have a sitting president who's running for re-election, they are going to be the nominee unless, like Lyndon Johnson, they make a decision that they're not going to do that. Now, there's plenty of sitting presidents who win that nomination again and then are weakened. Jimmy Carter's a great example of that. Ted Kennedy came at him and weakened him. Pat Buchanan came at George H.W. and he didn't win that re-election. But I just don't see an example of what you're suggesting is going to happen to Biden in the past. Is there one you're leaning on?
Sure. I'll give you a couple, and then I will and I will tell you why I believe that this is the case. First, I don't think there's a conspiracy, right? When you listen to the Sean Hannitys and others, and they seem to make this indication that there's some cabal going on the Democratic side where they've already picked a second place winner who's going to replace Biden, and Biden is going to voluntarily step down. That's either they don't understand politics, or they're just trying to create some type of conspiracy theory. The reality is politics is about power, and people don't give up power very easily. And giving up the presidency of the United States, that has to be one of the most difficult things for any politician to do. I think 1980 and 1968 are both instrumental. The first one was, we saw in 1968 what happened with Lyndon. We've already been over that. But then in 1980, Jimmy Carter faced a challenge from Ted Kennedy. Now, you could argue, yeah, and he won. He won. That's true, he did. He wasn't 82 years old. He wasn't facing Donald Trump, right? The country had no idea what Ronald Reagan would be like. There wasn't the amount of fear on the left of Ronald Reagan. I mean, that's not that they liked him, but there's a dread in this country by a large portion of the public of Donald Trump. They are worried. Many people are worried he's going to dismantle the United States. Now, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. I think this country is bigger than that. I think our court system are bigger than that. I don't think he may try, but I don't believe he'll be successful. But it doesn't matter. The amount of angst on the other side with him getting it, and the fear of that, and Joe Biden being 82 is unprecedented. It just really hasn't existed in American politics. I don't think there's a cabal or a plot. I think that there are natural forces at play that, as they begin to play out, is going to give Joe Biden more than he thinks, especially if Dean Phillips scores high in either Iowa or New Hampshire. Now, he's going to score high in New Hampshire because Biden is a write-in candidate. That in itself is going to make a difference.
Okay, you make a good case there. There's some differences there, and I'll take the Carter example and the fact that Biden's so much older. I don't think that Dean Phillips can win that nomination. So if somebody like Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom do enter the race, does it then become a free-for-all where everybody's jumping in the deep end of the pool? Because in that setting, Biden, as sitting president, probably sneaks over with a plurality. I don't know that the left has settled on who's next. They've only settled on that it shouldn't be Kamala Harris. So I just think that competitive primary with a sitting president would be really destructive and problematic, even more so than just a Ted Kennedy or a Pat Buchanan.
So my read of how this would all take place is that once you ended up with a group of candidates being in the race, I would be shocked if Joe Biden would stay in, because I think then he begins to recognize that it's problematic. Joe Biden, someone told me yesterday, he said, I haven't confirmed this, but somebody told me that he said yesterday that if Trump wasn't in the race, he wouldn't be in the race either. Again, I haven't confirmed that. I've tried to.
Joe Biden said that at a fundraiser. So that came from Joe Biden himself. He was at a fundraiser, so of course it wasn't open press, but somebody at the fundraiser either recorded it or reported it.
Yeah, and it's not lost on me the problem that his son's having, whether it's fair or unfair. My gut tells me it's probably unfair, but doesn't matter. Still his son, whether it's fair or unfair. And Joe exiting might take some of that pressure off. Actually, if Joe wanted to take pressure off, he could do it on his own. I think there's a whole set of things here that end up creating a pressure that it's just not as set as we think. And I do think that if Joe believed that someone else would have a better shot of beating Trump, I think he'd be more inclined to do it. Now, you're right. The problem is we have no way of knowing who will win that Democratic primary. I'm convinced if it's Elizabeth Warren, Trump would beat her every bit as much as he may beat Joe Biden. But I think if it's Whitmer or if it's Gavin Newsom, I think they'd both beat Donald Trump. I think that they would have a significantly better chance of beating him than Biden.
Well, it sure would make for entertaining TV and politics if what you suggest happens. And I know we do get surprised in these races. That always happens. I also would suggest if they were to do this to Joe Biden, it would be a very humiliating way to make the decision not to run for reelection. He would be better off just to make that decision now, rather than putting himself, his family, and his presidency through this. But like you said, when people are in power like that, oftentimes they can't see the reality that's in front of them.
Okay, so my main prediction is this. There's more to follow. This thing's going to have a lot more fireworks than we think, and there are going to be things that we wouldn't even expect. I personally believe that Donald Trump can still be beat in that primary, and that Joe Biden is not an assured thing. All right, so let's go to the last part of the show, because I do like to try to end our show by talking about something optimistic, although I'm very optimistic if we end up having either one of the two parties having a different candidate. That's something that would make me feel a lot better. So maybe it is hopeful thinking. But on to the issue that I really would like to talk about. You know, if you had a discussion with anyone over the last 15 years, and you tried to say that there wasn't a huge inequality that existed in wages, you would be dismissed. Now, that's because about 10 or 15 years ago, there were a set of 3 economists who came up with the numbers that showed how the inequality had grown dramatically between the top income earners and the bottom income earners, about a 16 times difference. One of the things that was pointed out in The Economist this week was that there is now a debate that is brewing amongst economists on this very issue. And one of the things that's happened is that as you begin to, as a new group of economists have looked at this and looked at the idea of as you adjust for taxes, the inequality hasn't actually grown. It's either stayed the same or reduced. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide, this is a different study. It was a book that was called The Myth of American Inequality. This was a book that was written by Phil Gramm, where he talks about, if you just look at the census data, you can see on this graph that there's a difference between the top and the bottom of about 16%. But if you go to the next slide, now this was a series of slides. I tried to make it simpler. But what you can see here is that the tax credits that are given to people at the very bottom income end of the economic scale and the amount of taxes that are paid by people at the top only end up result in about a 4 times difference. If that's true, this is one of the lowest inequality periods of time in American history. Now, again, that's a story that's hard to sell. But if you read The Economist this week, you'll see that it now is going beyond that book. If you pull up the next slide, in the book that they did, they made the point that almost all children are going to earn more real income than their parents, and that over 50 years we have the lowest income household benefit than most from upward mobility, and that today most people are as economically prosperous as people in the top 20% were 50 years ago. That's a complex statistic, but what they're saying is the majority of people today are doing better than the top 20% were doing 50 years ago. Go to the next slide for me. More Americans have achieved higher levels of education, and that value of that education has become much, much greater. That 60% of the households that women entered the workforce, dramatically increasing the number of 2-income household earners, and they did that while income continued to grow. Higher education and higher achievers tend to marry other people who are the same, and these social trends have increased earned households significantly. Let's go to the next slide. The Economist is doubling down on a whole other series of articles where they then talk about this is the golden age of workers, that for a wide variety of reasons, there are things happening in the workplace that are going to dramatically increase the income of people at the bottom level and narrow the gap even further. Now, that comes about because we're losing commodities out of Russia, because China demographics are beginning to shrink. As those demographics begin to shrink, they have less workers to be able to produce more goods. There's a trade war that's going on where we're reshoring people back home. Some of that's because of the deficit spending, which I'm not certain how much longer that can continue. But nonetheless, even if there's a recession, there's little doubt that that income inequality is going to shrink. If you look at the next slide, you can see the statistical number that's beginning to close between people at the lower end and at the upper end. And in the last slide, what I think is most important in this is you begin to see how much of a difference that makes if you're living in the United States versus living in a place like France. We're actually going to do dramatically better. So here's the point. If you were worried about your children not doing as well as you, quit worrying. They're going to do really well. In fact, if we're going to worry about something, here's what we have to worry about. We need more workers. We're going to have to figure out how to make certain that we can keep up with the demand side of the equation. Because if supply doesn't keep up with demand, the answer is pretty simple. You have inflation. But overwhelmingly, people are going to do better over the next 10, 20, 30 years in the United States than maybe we ever dreamed. And this issue of inequality, if these trends continue, you're going to see that dramatically narrow.
Keep beating this drum, Paul. I'm glad that you're pointing this out. I read Phil Graham's book some time ago. I think he makes a great case on the myths around this. I also want to say I think there's too much focus on inequality. Of course, it's a statistic, and we live in a nation where all men are created equal. We want to have equal opportunity for all people, and we want to have equal justice under the law. But in a free enterprise society, you're going to have some people that are inventors and entrepreneurs that have tremendous success. God bless them. They create a lot of jobs, and you're going to have a lot of people that choose to do other pursuits. And when you show the government spending and the fact that our social safety net has likely never been more generous and stronger, although in need of reform, I think it gives the facts around inequality. And we should be talking about a nation that should be just plentiful in opportunities for everyone that wants to pursue them.
Yeah, this debate about inequality has been going on for a while, and it was really in academic circles propelled by this book by Thomas Piketty, a French economist, who made this global claim that under capitalist systems, I guess in general, that the rate of return to capital, as he called it, versus the rate of return to labor, so sort of the return on interest on investments versus the return to workers, was always greater. And therefore, apart from in a few specific time periods, and he isolated this period after World War II in Europe and in the United States as a sort of a golden period of economic growth combined with less inequality, Piketty argued that we would always see growing inequality under capitalism. And he then went on to take that conclusion and say we needed all sorts of taxes on wealth at a global level, global coordination around taxes on wealth. But it's worth knowing that not all economists have always agreed, even with his basic data collection, right? So Piketty claimed to have these data going back to the early 20th century and into the 19th century, collected from many, many different sources. And not everyone agrees with his case. And so the debate has really started to shift a little bit more recently after this kind of hegemonic concern about inequality to people questioning whether inequality really has been growing as much as he's argued, especially when you account for transfers and taxes and redistribution. And I think it's good. I think there needs to be more moderation in this debate, because the inequality discourse had become kind of so hegemonic. And as the governor said, it was almost as if all we cared about was equality, right? And I think Milton Friedman who said that people try to pursue equality instead of freedom get neither. But if you try and pursue freedom, you will get quite a lot of equality as well. And so when we put equality as a sort of the be-all and end-all of public policy, we can end up making all sorts of really counterproductive policy decisions that hold back the entire economy, that cause all sorts of costs across the very same people that we're trying to help. And so I, for one, am glad that this sort of catastrophic discourse about inequality that Piketty and others had pushed so hard, that is being pushed back against, that we're seeing more moderation and a little more of an optimistic tone, and especially that we're seeing the idea come to the fore that a rising tide can lift all boats, right? That economic growth is good, that economic growth continues, and that, our children are going to be wealthier and have highest quality of life than we do, despite a lot of people believing the opposite.
That to me is the key. You're right. There's been this discourse on both the right and the left where the bumper sticker should almost say, "I got screwed."
Yeah.
Right? That's the bumper sticker. That somehow or another, my group, my generation, my economic class has been harmed. Now, saying that, I want to see people at that lower quartile do as well as they possibly can, because I do believe a lifting tide rises all boats, and I do believe that there are people in the United States that need help and that need assistance. Look, I grew up impoverished. If we weren't in the lowest economic rung, we were close to it. And my answer is giving those people opportunity is important. Now, I think the best opportunity you can give is education. I think that plays a massive role. But here's the thing that's so encouraging to me about this information. We've had guys like Ray Dalio and others who have been saying that somehow or another the United States is going to be displaced by China. And yet, a big part of that's based on this data that the inequality has grown so big that it's created these factions that will never get along with one another. I see a lot of divisions inside of our political system, but most people that I know want this place to work. And here's what's the most important about this. What this is saying is that capitalism works, that it's effective, that it actually can help shrink those economic inequalities that generally exist in society. And the more prosperity you have, the better off everyone does. And that has not been the narrative of either political party, at least over the last 4 years.
That's definitely true. We kind of live in an age of grievance, and Piketty, I think, really tapped into that. I mean, I was at a conference in Paris, it was about 10 years ago now, and Piketty was giving a keynote speech about his findings about inequality, and it was literally standing room only in the lecture theatre. They had an overflow lecture theatre where they had a live stream of his talk. This idea that inequality was growing and would continue to grow and sort of decimate developed economies, Western societies, if it was able to grow unchecked. This idea had huge popularity and a huge pull on people, but I don't think it really actually resonates with people's daily lives. I mean, and people's life experiences. You mentioned your family didn't have a lot of money when you were growing up. If you go back a couple of generations, in my family, they were landless peasants in the Highlands of Scotland, right? And they moved to New Zealand with absolutely nothing to show for themselves. They were so impoverished, they essentially fled Scotland. And then 2 generations later, I have a higher degree. I earned a PhD from University of Minnesota, and I'm a professor in the United States and have a very comfortable upper middle class life. And my grandfather, for example, really recognized that. He went from running a small team of horses, plowing fields with horses as a boy, to driving tractors, and then his grandson became a professor in America. He thought this wonderful thing. But when you talk to people today, that longer generational perspective on prosperity and on development in our societies, I think, has been completely lost. And people have fallen prey to this idea that everything is getting worse all the time, and it's just not true. And it's not true for my family. It's not true for your family. It's not true for many, many families, even though for many families, things are very difficult. And some families do experience great hardship. I think it's important to show and to demonstrate and reiterate very often that the systems that we have been incredibly successful in generating wealth and higher standards of living And this catastrophic thinking is it's simply not accurate. It honestly doesn't bear up even to the most brief of scrutiny. But we'll talk about that more as the podcast continues, Paul.
We will. And again, we put this in because we think that optimistic news, being able to see that exists, is part of what it is that makes certain that we renew the American spirit. Henry, Governor, thanks for being on. We appreciate it. This will be our last show for the year, and we appreciate you guys being with us, but we'll be back next year in January. Thanks again. Godspeed.
Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned, and we can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.